Pretty much. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Okay, how about now? One moment, please. They don't teach us this in seminary. All right, are we good now? Okay. So good morning, everyone. I'd like to start off by saying I'm surprised everyone's still here. I thought you were going to read in the announcements, seminary, and you would all run for the parking lot. So thank you for being here. So this morning I'd like to talk to you a little bit about where God dwells. I just want to give you a little bit of a background of where I kind of came up with this study. So growing up, I read the Bible. I'm making sure nobody's taking notes here, but I would read it, Genesis, Exodus, Joshua. I'd skip over Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all that stuff about, building the tabernacle and all that stuff. I don't have any interest in that. And then when I was in middle school, I saw this movie. I think you guys probably have heard of it. It's called Raiders of the Lost Ark. He goes after this Ark of the Covenant. And I kind of got an interest in it and a thing, so I had to go back and I had to read all those portions of Scripture that I skipped over. And parts of it, it still went over my head because I was only a middle schooler, so I was like, what's a cubits? And okay, what's this? What's a seraphim? I don't know. So it kind of became like a side interest to me. And I kept that interest, and I went to Concordia Irvine, and I got to, one of the last classes I took was Biblical Theology with Dr. Brighton. And in Biblical Theology, we used a book, it's called From Eden to the New Jerusalem. And it's basically biblical theology, and he walks through 4 different things. He walks through the temple, atonement, holiness, and the dwelling of God. And that's kind of where I got this interest. And I don't know if it's a side interest or a hobby, but I love to study the temple and biblical archaeology. So I wanted to share that with you this morning. So as we begin, in the Old Testament, before the temple was built, I just want to ask, where did God dwell? And we kind of know. So over the next couple of weeks, I'd like to do a bit of an overview of the dwelling places of God, starting with the Old Testament, and then I'll talk a little bit about the intertestamental time, and then ending with the New Testament and the new creation, where we find the temple. So to begin with, what we need to understand is the place where God dwells is seen where he dwells. But we think of when we come to church that this is where we come to church and we worship God, right? Well, early in the Old Testament, people didn't go to the place where God was, where the deity lived, to worship. He kind of lived there, and you stayed away from it. So the first dwelling we have, some scholars think is from Genesis, and they go back to the Garden of Eden. And from chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. And they heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" As you can notice in your handout, the first dwelling of God, I put a question mark because it's kind of a split thing between scholars. Some think that this is technically the first dwelling place of God because he was with Adam and Eve. He walked with them. He talked with them. But we can't agree on it. So I put that question mark. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm going to let the more qualified people that are more like scholarly have that argument. So we're going to move on to the next place. So the first place, yes. Uh-huh. Yeah. They can't agree altogether this is the first place where God dwelled with his people. They can't make a clear decision on it. In Eden, yes, correct. There are other scholars point out we read about how they built altars to worship God. Maybe that's where he dwelt, but I'm not gonna go there because I'm not qualified to do that. I don't want to I'll let the scholars and the people who know that. So So we're going to move on to the tabernacle. This is after the Exodus, after the Israelites are brought out from Egypt. And God tells Moses that he wants them to build a special tent. And as the book says, it's a special tent, the manufacture of which is described in great detail in the second half of Exodus. That part of Exodus I didn't read growing up. I had to go back and look at. So in Exodus 25, it says, and let them make a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst. The key term for this Bible study is going to be dwell, and that's going to be one of the things we pick up on. So the details for the tabernacle are laid out from chapters 25 to 30. He tells them to build it, what it's going to look like, what should be in there. And then there's kind of this break in the narrative, and we get other stories like the golden calf incident. And then in chapter 37 to 40, again, it's picked up again with the tabernacle and the priest. So there are three areas that make up the tabernacle. There's the curtain barrier that forms a rectangle. So the tabernacle formed a rectangle. It would have been really good to have a PowerPoint. I could just point. So the barrier is a rectangle, and then there's this large tent. And this tent is divided into two sections. The first place is called the holy place. There's the table of the showbread. The showbread is like the bread when David went in, or when he was on the run from Saul, he went in and ate. That's the showbread. And then there's the incense altar, where they would burn incense to the Lord as they were calling upon him. The second room is the Holy of Holies. We're all familiar with this one. There's the Ark of the Covenant. And inside the Ark of the Covenant, we all know that the Ten Commandments were housed, and then pieces of the manna were also in there. So the tabernacle is built in Exodus 40. And this is the first time in the Bible where we have this thing of the presence of God coming and filling that area. In verse 34 it says, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." So God came down in a cloud, and he descended into the tabernacle, and that's where he dwelt. I need to make clear is, during this time, God wasn't only found in the tabernacle. I want everyone to understand that. But that is where the people found him, was in the tabernacle. In the tabernacle, it was portable. You could move it around. Thinking about it, it was kind of like a portable church. Imagine if we could take Good Shepherd and we could just, pack it up and move it down the road because we're going to Chicago or wherever. That's what they did. The tabernacle was portable. Every time the Israelites were on their journey to the Promised Land, they'd close it up, they'd fold it up, and they'd take it with them. And we know that the Ark of the Covenant would go before them, because we read in Joshua when they're entering Canaan and they're going across the river Jordan, that the Ark of the Covenant goes before them, and it kind of parts the waters of the Jordan, and they just walk right on through. So throughout all their journeys, whenever that cloud settled, it was the glory of the Lord filling the tabernacle. So when they would close up the tabernacle to move it down the road, the glory of the Lord would kind of leave it. But he'd go with them, and he'd go with them, as it says in Exodus chapter 40, verses 38. "For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys." So God continued to dwell with them even when the tabernacle was being moved along. So we have the tabernacle. They enter the Promised Land. We read that they fight various people. There's various enemies they take on. And then we come to King David, and he takes Jerusalem. And David is a great king. He's a man after God's own heart. And he feels so bad because the Almighty One is dwelling in a tent. As it says in 2 Samuel, the king said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in the tent." So David is dwelling in his palace, and God's living in a tent, basically. And David wants to build a temple, but God says, no, it's your son Solomon. He's going to build the temple. So King Solomon is the one who builds the God's temple. In 1 Kings chapters 5 and 8, it lays out in great detail the building of the temple and all the furnishings that were found in it. So I'm going to flip here to 1 Kings. I'm going to just read a couple of things here. He cast 2 pillars of bronze. 18 cubits was the height of one pillar, and a line of 12 cubits measured in circumference. It was hollow. Its thickness was 4 fingers. The second pillar was the same. He also made 2 capitals of cast bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. The heights of one capital was 5 cubits, and the height of the other capital was 5 cubits. In 2 rows around the one lacet work to cover the capital was the top of the pillar. He did the same with the other. So in these chapters, it lays out in great detail what went into the temple, all the different things, the beauty that was found in this temple. Some say it was a wonder of the ancient world. There was gold, there was oak. It was just amazing. And there again, the temple is, it's kind of similar to the tabernacle. It was the rectangular outside, then you had the inside, the building, and then you had the 2 different areas. You had the holy place, and then you had the Holy of Holies. And this temple, it wasn't portable. They didn't just close up shop and take it. This was permanent. So inside you had the holy place where, again, you had the altar of incense, and you also had the table of the showbread. And then you had a curtain and that divided the holy place from the Holy of Holies. And inside the Holy of Holies, of course, was the Ark of the Covenant. And the priest could only go into the Holy of Holies one time a year to make atonement. So chapter 6 of 1 Kings, it tells of the beauty that's found in this temple. It was just amazing. In chapter 8 of 1 Kings, the Ark of the Covenant, the thing that the people have brought with them, is brought into the temple. After the completion of the temple, God comes and he dwells again. It's kind of similar to the account in Exodus from 1 Kings. And when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. So they build the temple, and God comes in a cloud, and he fills it with his presence. And it's so awe to the priests that they can't even minister because of this cloud. I was reading this, and I was trying to imagine what that must have been like to be a priest at that time, and the glory of the Lord just to come down, and you have to walk away. I can't, I don't know how that, I'm just trying to imagine it. So the temple is built, and the people, they're doing okay. From Eden to New Jerusalem, there is this, he calls it, there is a peak in Jerusalem with the building of the temple. And after that becomes the sustained decline. And then, but we have those periods of righteous kings like Josiah, but mainly it was a decline of the temple. And under King Solomon, the kingdom divides into 2. In the southern kingdom, you have Rehoboam, and in the northern kingdom, you have Jeroboam. And Jeroboam he's not a good king. And he's scared that his people are going to take over or kill him and worship Rehoboam, because Rehoboam is in Jerusalem. He has the temple. So Jeroboam gets this great idea. I know what I'm going to do to avoid this. I'm gonna set up 2 calves. We're going to put one in Bethel and one in Dan. That way they can go and worship, and they're still in my land. They won't leave the country. They won't kill me. And he thinks this is a great idea, but as you can see in 1 Kings, then this thing, it became a sin for the people because they went as far as Dan to be before one. And we don't really know if God dwelled in where these 2 calves are. I'm going to say no, because there's no scriptural account, but we don't know. So things continue to go from, let's say, bad to worse in Jerusalem. And God just doesn't, surprise. No, he sends prophets to warn the people, to warn them about the anger of the Lord and the coming destruction. In Ezekiel chapter 10, before the temple is destroyed, Ezekiel records and describes the opposite of the glory of the Lord dwelling with his people. He records how the glory of the Lord leaves the temple. So I want to read that fast here. All right, and before I read this, there's some images in here that we don't know what to make of. There's going to be this image of the wheel, and but our main look at these verses is to here describe how the presence of the Lord leaves the temple. And the cherubim mounted up. There were the living creatures that I saw by the Sheber canal, and when the cherubim went, the wheels went beside them. And when the cherubim lifted up their wings to mount up from the earth, the wheels did not turn from beside them. When they stood still, these stood still. And when they mounted up, these mounted up with them. For the spirit of the living creatures was in them. Then the glory of the Lord went out from the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubim. And the cherubim lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth before my eyes as they went out with the wheels beside them. And they stood at the entrance of the east gate of the house of the Lord, and the glory of the Lord of Israel was over them. These were the living creatures that I saw underneath the God of Israel by the cherubim canal, and I knew that they were the cherubim. Each had 4 faces, and each had 4 wings, and underneath their wings the likeness of human hands. And as for the likeness of their faces, they were the same faces whose appearance I had seen by the cherubim canal. Each one of them went straight forward. So here Ezekiel is describing in his prophecy, his weird prophecy, the presence of the Lord leaving the temple because of what's about to come. In the book From Eden to the New Jerusalem, the author has this great quote: "The idolatry, bloodshed, and injustice of the people has forced God to leave the temple and the city." Because the people were worshiping other gods, which was their biggest sin, and then with all the bloodshed, them killing other people, and then the injustice. During this time, Israel was prospering, but at the same time, they were crushing the poor and the widows and neglecting them, which God had told them, this is how you are to care for them. They kind of were just neglecting them. And this forced God to leave the temple and the city. He was still with his people, but he wasn't there in this form that he had become to know. So it's bad, it's worse, and then it just gets worse for the people. The last part is we have the destruction. So in 586, we have the Babylonians led by Nebuchadnezzar. They come in and they destroy the city, and they destroy the kingdom and the temple. But they don't They destroy the temple, but they also raid it. They take a lot of the stuff that was inside of the temple. This is the last time in the narrative that we see the Ark of the Covenant, or hear about the Ark of the Covenant. It just kind of disappears. Nothing's ever mentioned again. We don't see it again until, Indiana Jones finds it, but yeah, that's the last time. There's no mention of it after the temple is raided and then destroyed. The prophet Jeremiah in chapter 52, he gives us this vision of what he saw. And he burned the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned down. So here Jeremiah is describing how Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came in, and they not only destroyed, they burned stuff to the ground. They raided the temple, they took a lot of stuff, and then they burned it to the ground. And then they smashed the wall of Jerusalem. So going back just a little bit, that's the narrative part. So I want to talk a little more in depth about the temple, since we've done the narrative story part of how the temple fits in. So there's an interesting comparison with the temples. So in Eden, it was in the east. So the tabernacle, you'd enter from the east. It was the same way with the temple. You would enter from the east. So some scholars point out how that's similar. Again, I'm not going to debate that because I'm not qualified for that, but that is one thing that they point out, the similarities of the way you'd enter each of these dwelling places of God. You'd enter from the east. Another thing is some of the things that were found in the temple I kind of passed over, but we can talk a little bit about more in depth. So, let me flip back here. Can't even remember where my verse is. Okay. So, some of the things that were found in we'll start with the terminology. So, the first temple is I'm going to call it the first temple. That's the one we're going to look at today, the one that is destroyed by the Babylonians. Next week, we're going to talk about, sometimes it's called the second temple or Herod's temple. That's the temple of Jesus, that Jesus goes to. And then also we'll talk about the new creation temple. So inside the temple is all this beauty and things. So we think of beauty, and we don't know what the temple looked. We don't know what it looked like because we don't have a picture of it. But the Scripture gives us a very good description of it. And I would encourage you this week, if you have some kind of study Bible, it's very helpful, and it will it'll walk you through and describe to you in detail some of the things that were found in the temple. So some of the artifacts that were found was gold was overlaid in this temple. The beams and threshold, the beams were made of cedar. Thank you. The cedar wood, and cedar is very strong, and it's very pretty. It comes from Lebanon. If you come to the Wednesday night service, you'll hear about what happens to some of the mountains of Lebanon. So you had the pillars that were nice, and then you had the gold overlay, and then you had the altar of the incense where they would burn the incense as they were calling upon the Lord, and that was a stand about that big. It was gold, and they would the thing is when they would worship is they take some kind of incense. We don't know exactly what type, but they would place it on there, and then they would kind of light it on fire, and the smoke would go up, and it would go up to the nose of the Lord as it says in the Hebrew, and it was pleasing in his sight. Also in the holy room, you had the bread of the presence, and it was on like a stand. And that was replaced daily because, bread would mold. So when David's on the run, he goes and he eats that, and no one is supposed to eat the bread of the presence. That is a reminder of God being with his people. So as we move into the Holy of Holies, there's the curtain, and we know from the Gospels that curtain kind of separated the holy from the Holy of Holies, where the priest could only enter in one time a year. And that curtain was kind of like a barrier. And we know from the Gospels when Jesus died, that curtain was torn in two. So as you go into the Holy of Holies, you had the Ark of the Covenant. We don't know what the Ark of the Covenant looked like. We only have the description from the Scriptures. And then we have like renderings of it from artists. But we know it had a cherubim and a seraphim on both sides. We know that it was laced in gold. And we know that the people weren't allowed to touch it, because we know from the Scriptures that when they were moving it the one time, one of the wheels broke off the wagon, and one of the guys went to touch it, and he dissolved. So they weren't allowed to touch it. So they would carry it on poles. So at the end of the ark, there were like little rings, and they'd put the poles in there and they'd carry it. So they would carry it. And inside the Ark of the Covenant, we know that they had the Ten Commandments. They had the second version of the Ten Commandments, because remember the first ones when Moses came down from Mount Sinai. He looked, and the people were worshiping the golden calf, and in his anger, he threw them at them, and then he told them, "I'm going to ground these into dust, and he makes them eat them." So God has to reissue the Ten Commandments. So we know from Scripture that the Ten Commandments were housed inside the ark. We also know that the manna, when the people were in the wilderness and they didn't have any food, and they complained like we all do, and they asked, "What will we do?" God's like, "All right." So at night, he'd have it rain like a heavy dew. It was heavy enough that the people could use it to make bread and things. And we know that some of that was contained within the ark. And I was thinking about the ark. I'm like, all right, so it's solid gold. It's got probably the stone tablets in it. I'm like, that's got to be pretty heavy. They had to have some pretty strong guys to carry it. And remember that the Ark of the Covenant, every time that the Israelites would journey in their journey to the Promised Land, they had to pick it up and carry it down the road. They didn't have cars like we know we have, or trucks where you could just put it in there and drive. Yeah, they had to carry it. So those are some of the things. Then we have the garment that the priest wears. It's kind of similar to people ask nowadays where does the inspiration for what pastors wear come from? It comes from the Old Testament, from the temple. They did wear the white, like pastors do nowadays, but they didn't have just the stole. They had a fancy jewel gold piece that they would wear. The high priest, and that's where a lot of that comes from. When the priest would go to make atonement on the Day of Atonement, when he'd go into the Holy of Holies, he was the only one that was allowed in there. So there's evidence that since he was the only one allowed in there, and the presence of the Lord was in there, that before he would enter it, they'd take a rope and they'd tie it to the priest, and he'd go in there, and he'd offer his thing in the presence of the Lord. And it was such an overwhelming experience that he would, I don't know if he'd lose his conscience or what, but they'd have to pull him back. They'd have to use the rope to pull him out because the presence of the Lord was so overwhelming. some other things. So when the temple is destroyed, they raid it and they take a lot of the gold and a lot of the cups. The things they couldn't take were like the gold that was laid into the foundation. So I brought up the point at the beginning. I wanted to make sure I got back to this. That in the Genesis time, the people didn't go to worship the Lord. The temple or the place where the deity dwelled was kind of where they dwell. You didn't go and worship like we do on Sundays. That changes not much with the tabernacle, because the only one we have an account of that ever really entered into the tabernacle was Moses. And Moses, again, we read about how he went up to Mount Sinai and he saw the presence of the Lord and his face glowed and they had to cover it. It was kind of similar when he went into the tabernacle. He would go in there and then he'd have to kind of cover his face because the presence of the Lord would shone through him. When the temple comes along, it changes and the people are allowed to, or they go forward and they worship. But they don't go all the way in like we come into the church all the way. They were only allowed to go to a certain amount of the temple. So it was a rectangular object, right? And there was the 3 levels. So if you were Jewish, you were allowed to go to the outer courts. If you were a priest, like a Levite, you were allowed to go a little bit further into the temple. And you could go and you could offer prayers and worship. Now, if you're the lucky high priest, like Aaron or his brothers, then you got to go in all the way to you got to go to the holy room. And then once a year, as I said before, you got to go in there on the Day of Atonement and your full garb, and you'd go in and you would offer a sacrifice. And like I said, they'd have to tie a rope to you because you'd go in there and you'd just be awe-inspired by the presence of God. They'd have to pull you out. So I'm going to pause here for questions. All right. I apologize. I'm really bad with names, so I'm just going to point. All right. We'll start over.
How long did they have the tabernacle, year-wise, and then how many years did they have
The first temple?
before they got torn down?
Shortly after. It took them a while, because we'll talk about that next. Yeah, because they started and then they stopped, and then Nehemiah had to kind of, okay guys, we got to get this built. So, but it was actually 70 AD. The Romans came in and they leveled it. So, you were asking about the tabernacle. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure how long of a difference there was between them having the tabernacle and then the temple. Because we know they wandered in the desert for 40 years. But yeah, I'm not going to 100% sure how long they had the tabernacle compared to the temple. It had to be quite a while, because you figure they went 40 years in the desert, and then we come all the way to King David and then King Solomon. That's down the line. So it's quite a while. Yeah, so they had the tabernacle for about 500 years before they built the temple. Wow. Wow, I'm surprised by that too. I'm just like, God dwelled in a tent for 500, wow. I learned something new today. All right, let's see. All right. Yes. Next week, I'm gonna have like some PowerPoint pictures because I'm like, they're gonna be like, what? Yeah. So I don't know how to describe it, but it's bigger than, because I had a tent growing up as a kid. I loved to like camp outside and stuff. It was bigger than that. So I can't really define how big it was, but it was fairly size. It was big, and it took them quite a while to put it up and then take it down. It took like a small army. The one thing I didn't bring up is the tabernacle was always in the middle of their camp when they would camp, when they'd move camp. Wherever they'd set up camp, they'd put all their houses or tents or whatever, and the tabernacle was always in the middle, always in the center of the portable city, I guess we're going to call it. I'm going to say in the holy place because he wasn't a priest. And Samuel was, let me see. Yeah, go ahead. So she brought up the point about Samuel, or young, is it Samuel? Okay, I just want Samuel, and where was he when God called him? We know he wasn't in the temple because the temple wasn't built yet. So he had to be someplace in the tabernacle, but we don't know, the text doesn't tell us exactly where he was. If I had to take an educated guess from all the evidence that I see, I would say he was probably either sleeping in like the holy place, or maybe there was like an area for sleeping, because Eli was also the priest. So, but I don't know for sure. Yes. They all had to basically come to the tabernacle. This is where we get the first idea of people like coming together to the dwelling place of God. And that's where Jeroboam got the idea that, Jeroboam had the idea that, all the people are going to go to the southern kingdom, because that's where the temple is in Jerusalem, and they're all going to flee, or they're going to kill me and go follow Rehoboam because he has the temple. So yeah, once the people got to the land of Canaan, the tabernacle was set up, and if you wanted to like worship God or offer or bring incense or something, or offer a sacrifice, you'd go to the tabernacle. One more time? It is, but I'm not sure. He's either in the holy place or he's in the Holy of Holies. I haven't looked that far ahead, but that is like one thing I am looking at is, because he's in there and he's offering, it's a sacrifice or prayers, and the angel appears to him, and he's just like overwhelmed. So, but I will look for you for that next week, and I will make sure I have an answer for you.
Question about the tabernacle or the Ark of the Covenant. Does it seem to be that someone on the way the Philistines stole it?
Mm-hmm.
And so they had all kinds of trouble because they had it, and then yoke oxen or something like that they used to bring the Ark back. When exactly, this had to be before the temple was built, obviously. So during the when David was king,
Yeah. When after the Israelites entered the land of Canaan, their main we'll say enemy that they had a lot of problems with was the Philistines, and the Philistines in one case they stole the ark, and they were like, wow, this is cool, and they brought it back, and all it does is create problems for them. So they basically just give it back to the Israelites, and a lot of this happens under King David. This happens before the ark is brought into Jerusalem. I thought you were going to ask me where is the Ark of the Covenant today. I'm like, I know the theories, I just don't want to get in trouble. So that, and then you have a church in Ethiopia. It says they have it, and it's behind this this curtain, and no one's allowed to see it. So you just got to go with blind faith that they maybe have it, but after, like I said, after the temple is destroyed, the Ark of the Covenant just kind of drops off the narrative. I was telling my dad growing up, I'm like, Dad, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask God, where is the Ark of the Covenant? Because as a kid, it fascinates me, the Ark of the Covenant, the importance of it, and then it just disappears out of the narrative. All right. Any more questions? It's interesting instance because I grew up in the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, and the first time I ever saw incense was in Concordia Irvine. I went to Greek Orthodox Church. I was like, wow. It's something we're not used to. We don't practice it. We do it sometimes at the seminary, but not to the extent like the Greek Orthodox Church did. Wow. It's interesting to see it because it reminds you this is what they did in the Old Testament, but at the same time, it's overwhelming for us. Any more questions? All right. So as you go into this week, I would encourage you to not do what I did growing up and just skip over the parts of Exodus and Numbers, Leviticus, all that stuff, where they talk about building the tabernacle. To kind of go back and just kind of read through it and kind of imagine it in your mind. And maybe if you can do a Google search on the tabernacle, there's some great images. Also with the temple, you can do the same thing. So next week we'll have part 2, and will be the conclusion of where God dwells. We'll pick up the narrative of the temple has been destroyed, what happens next. And then I'll talk a little bit about the intertestamental period, what goes on with the temple. It won't be a lot because that's not scriptural, it's not biblical, it comes from the Apocrypha, but it is helpful and kind of helps us to understand the temple. And then we'll talk about the New Testament temple, the one that King Herod built. And we'll talk about Jesus' interaction with the temple. And then we'll talk about how in 70 AD, the Romans had enough of the Jewish people, and they just come in and they clobber it and destroy it. And then we'll close out that time by talking about the temple and the new creation, and the new creation in Revelation that John talks about. So that's where we're going to head next week. So we'll close with the word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time we've had together to study your word, to learn more about the places where you dwelled with your people in the Old Testament. Lord, as we leave this dwelling place where you are with us, we ask that you would remind us that you are with us, that you would go with us this week and dwell with us. When things of this life this week just seem to overwhelm us and we feel at the end of hope, help us to come back to you. Help us to come back to your word and to remember that you dwelled with your people in the Old Testament. Even when their temple was destroyed, you continued to dwell with them and to promise to bring them back. Lord, I just ask that you would dwell with all of us this week. In your name we pray. Amen.